questions. I'm Oriana Schuyler Master. I'm a center fellow here at CSAC at the Freeman Spogli Institute, where I also work on China and military issues. So it's a distinct pleasure. I mean, if it was up to me, all CSAC seminars would be about the Chinese military, but maybe once I'm promoted, that'll be my first thing to institute. But for now, as I'm still a junior faculty member, I at least have the privilege of moderating this discussion with Fiona Cunningham, in which she's going to talk to us about her new book, which you can all see. I have one too. Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security. Fiona is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, where her research interests intersect between technology and conflict with a focus on China. Her book that just came out with Princeton University Press, and it examines China's distinctive approach to the dilemma of coercing an adversary under the shadow of nuclear war, which relies on substitutes for nuclear threats. Fiona has published widely, of course, in other venues, including International Security, Washington Quarterly, and has a number of interesting future projects. So I think this is definitely not the last time we'll be hearing from Fiona, but I look forward to hearing her discuss her book today. So she'll speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to questions. So over to you.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay on the podium mic? Excellent. Okay. Well, I want to begin just by saying a huge thank you to Oriana, to Harold for the invitation, to Eliana for making the event happen, and to the CSAC community more broadly here at Stanford for hosting me. It is my absolute pleasure to talk about my book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security, which was published in January this year by Princeton University Press. And this book is about what makes China's post-Cold War approach to strategic deterrence distinctive from that of other powers, and how we can sort of use that difference to better understand, I think, what is one of the most important issues in international security, which is how technological change intersects with nuclear weapons. And I'll pause here just to say that it is a particular privilege for me to be here at CSAC to talk about my book, because I spent much of my postdoctoral fellowship here back in 2018-19 working on the manuscript, and I believe that I was one of the first CSAC fellows to span both the nuclear as well as cyber projects. And I see Mentor Herblin here in the room with us. That made CSAC, I think, a really ideal home in which to sort of nurture a book project that was trying to bring nuclear, cyber, but also some other technological areas into conversation with each other without doing violence to the kind of distinctive characteristics of those technologies. So it's a real pleasure to particularly be here at CSAC. So I'm going to take about 30 minutes or 32 minutes, I'll say, to give you a sense of what the book is about and perhaps why you might like to read it. So I'm going to begin with three kind of key ideas in this book: the limited war dilemma, strategic substitution, and information age weapons. So the limited war dilemma really tees up the research question at the heart of the book. Strategic substitution is kind of a way of coping with that problem, and information age weapons as a way of kind of implementing that strategic substitution coping mechanism. I'll then introduce my theory of strategic substitution. I'll tell you a little bit about the research design that I use in this book and the sources. And I'll then give you a little bit of a taste of the empirical chapters of the book that cover China's nuclear, offensive cyber operations, counterspace capabilities, and precision conventional missiles decision-making, and how its kind of capabilities have evolved in those areas. And I'll end the talk with a bit of an evaluation of how China's foreign policy choices have fared now over 25 years, and end with some contributions of this book to the international relations scholarship. If you want to ask about policy implications as well, please feel free to do so in the Q&A. So this book at its core is about how states cope with a dilemma that the nuclear age has created for all countries that possess nuclear weapons and want to continue to use their military capabilities for coercive leverage against other nuclear armed adversaries. And that is, how can they continue to do so without triggering a catastrophic nuclear war? And in particular, in the case of China, how can they gain coercive leverage against their adversaries if they haven't done what most nuclear armed states have done to cope with this limited war dilemma? So in brief, you can think of the other kind of options for coping with this limited war dilemma as being on the left-hand side of the slide, fielding or sort of very impressive conventional military capabilities that could threaten decisive victory against one's adversaries for coercive leverage. That's what the United States has done in the post-Cold War era, or as represented by the missile silo in the center of the slide, threatening nuclear weapons first use to cope with this dilemma, like Pakistan and Russia. But China didn't take either of these two approaches in the post-Cold War era, which led a lot of scholars and strategists to speculate that China had like a secret first-use nuclear strategy. But I argue in this book that actually China took a third approach, which I call strategic substitution. So what is strategic substitution? At its simplest, it involves threatening to use non-nuclear weapons in ways that could gain strategic effects against an adversary and directly shape its behavior. And those threats to use non-nuclear weapons in particularly provocative, escalatory manners are paired together with a strategy for a country's nuclear weapons that threatens to use nuclear weapons only when that country is first attacked by another country with nuclear weapons. So what we often call in the nuclear strategy literature, an assured retaliation posture. And what this combination enables a country to do is to use these provocative attacks using non-nuclear capabilities to increase the risk of escalation, including up to the use of nuclear weapons into a nuclear war, without actually having to threaten to make to use their own nuclear weapons without threatening making nuclear threats. In fact, what strategic substitution is trying to do is to actually force the adversary or provoke the adversary to be the one to take that monumental step of crossing the threshold of using nuclear weapons first. And this approach, therefore, has promised to serve as a substitute for one of these two traditional answers to the limited war dilemma that I outlined on the previous slide, either threatening nuclear first use or possessing conventional capabilities that could threaten a decisive victory against an adversary. But I want to emphasize what strategic substitution is not. First of all, it doesn't mean that a country only uses its information age weapons for coercion. Countries can also use their kind of non-nuclear capabilities that they plan to use to implement strategic substitution for warfighting, provided that any time those warfighting and coercive roles end up clashing, that clash is resolved in favor of the coercive applications. And we see this in areas like how countries decide to command and control their forces, where warfighting might require more delegation of the use of these capabilities, while coercion might require leaders to sort of keep control of their use. It also does not preclude a country from building up conventional or nuclear capabilities that could enable them to select some of these more traditional options for coping with the limited war dilemma in the future. So another key idea in the book is that information age weapons can be used to implement strategic substitution because they promise to provide states with coercive leverage. And information age weapons is my shorthand term for precision conventional missiles that rely on information networks to guide them to their targets, as well as counterspace or offensive cyber operations that disrupt an adversary's use of either computer networks or its satellites. And stepping back, what all answers to the limited war dilemma need to do is to give a state bargaining leverage, the ability to alter an adversary's assessment of the costs and risks of taking certain actions in peacetime, in a crisis, or in a conflict. And information age weapons look promising for this role because some of them share at least three attributes that enable them to threaten escalation and have strategic effects. First, they can have large-scale damaging effects against an adversary's military, its society, or its allies that cannot be easily defended against. Second, they cross salient thresholds in limited conflicts, which we can think of as kind of the boundaries in terms of geographical scope or intensity that two belligerents might decide to sort of tacitly agree on in a conflict. And third, and perhaps most importantly, All of these capabilities can increase the risk of nuclear war because they share technology with nuclear weapons. In the case of precision conventional missiles, the same types of missiles can deliver nuclear warheads to their targets. And in the case of counterspace or offensive cyber operations, those capabilities can be used to attack the supporting infrastructure for an adversary's nuclear arsenal. But these information age weapons, like a lot of military capabilities, just possessing them alone is not going to allow you to generate these coercive effects and threaten escalation. Rather, these capabilities need to be postured explicitly to create escalation risks using that kind of bundle of capabilities, doctrines, organizing one's forces, command and control arrangements, or even signaling to their adversaries that these escalation risks might be adrift. And so I argue that states can either dial up those escalation risks using what I call a brinkmanship posture that envisages a process of escalation and tries to create a process of escalation that's like sliding down a slippery slope that neither country can control, or they can try and dial down or manage those escalation risks by using what I call a calibrated escalation force posture, that is more akin to climbing rungs on a ladder with these sort of carefully controlled steps towards the top of the escalation ladder. So this strategic substitution idea of coping with the limited war dilemma might sound brilliant to some of you. It might sound ridiculous and foolish to others. But in reality, strategic substitution is pretty similar to the nuclear or the conventional options for answering the limited war dilemma, which is they have pros and they have cons. There's no silver bullet to dealing with this dilemma. So why would a country such as China choose to adopt this option for coping with the limited war dilemma rather than others? And in the book, I develop a theory of strategic substitution to explain why. Briefly, the theory can be summarized as follows. A leverage deficit, which is the independent variable, initiates a search for coercive leverage, which is the mechanism in these gray nodes in the center of the chart that results in the pursuit of an information age weapon for coercive leverage, the dependent variable on this side of the figure. So to go through these components in a little bit more detail, leverage deficits basically emerge when a state's threat environment changes, perhaps because of a crisis or a conflict with an adversary. And that can reveal a problem. And that is that the state lacks the military capabilities that are sort of suitable and adequate for either the type of war that they're going to need to fight or the type of adversary that they're going to need to fight, or both of those two things. So if they choose to ignore that leverage deficit, that means if there's a political dispute with that adversary in the future, they're either going to have to make humiliating diplomatic concessions, or alternatively, they're going to have to fight a war that they're going to lose. So very few countries experience leverage deficits and just choose to ignore them. But when searching for additional coercive leverage to redress these deficits, different priorities led China down a different pathway to that of other nuclear countries. Some states are particularly sensitive to the disadvantages of the conventional option. So that might lead them to prefer the nuclear option. Other countries might be more sensitive to the disadvantages of the nuclear option and think about the conventional option instead in dealing with these leverage deficits. But in China's case, it was actually sensitive to the disadvantages of both. It was both conventionally inferior to the United States and faced a very difficult, lengthy journey at redressing that gap in conventional capabilities, and its leaders doubted the credibility of threatening nuclear weapons first use. So given these sensitivities, information age weapons can actually be quite appealing substitutes because their advantages are the precise opposite of the conventional and nuclear options. Namely, it's much quicker to acquire information age weapons that can be used for coercive leverage than redressing an unfavorable conventional military balance. And it's much more credible to threaten to use information age weapons because they're simply less destructive than engaging in a nuclear attack. After a state decides to pursue information age weapons for coercive leverage, to complete that search for leverage sort of successfully, they still then need to go ahead and select one of these force postures for their information age weapons. I don't actually theorize or sort of provide a theory to explain choices among these two force postures in the book, but I do offer some thoughts on the factors that influence them. So in the book, I then test the theory of strategic substitution against its most plausible alternative explanations using comparative case studies of all of the information age weapons that China has pursued since it first began to face this limited war dilemma in earnest in 1995. And for each of these cases, I engage in both process tracing as well as congruence testing. So I'll use this table up on the slide taken from the book to kind of walk you through how I've gone about establishing the theory and ruling out some of the alternative explanations. And those alternative explanations are either going to be China selected other ways of coping with the limited war dilemma than strategic substitution, or China pursued information age weapons for other reasons than dealing with these leverage deficits. So starting with the center column of the slide there under the leverage deficit, you'll see the Taiwan Strait crisis. And that crisis was really a watershed for China and plays an important role in the book because it confirmed to China's leaders that they were going to need to prepare to fight a limited war in their periphery against the country with the most advanced conventional as well as nuclear capabilities on the planet, and that country was likely to intervene. Before that point, there was at least some ambiguity about whether or not the United States would intervene if there was a war between the United States, between China and Taiwan over the status of that island and its independence in particular. So that crisis confronted China with a severe leverage deficit, and China then faced a second leverage deficit that deepened its sense of the gap that existed between the capabilities it had and what it needed in order to adequately deter the United States. And that second leverage deficit occurred in 1999 when the United States accidentally bombed China's embassy in Belgrade, which to this day, many Chinese leaders and strategists believe was not an accident. But my analysis in each chapter long precedes the date at which China made a decision to pursue these information age weapons, and I start the analysis earlier than those dates for two main reasons. First, I want to demonstrate that China's leaders didn't face leverage deficits earlier than these dates. Otherwise, that would have led them to an earlier decision to pursue these information age weapons. And in the book, I actually explain why it is that when China faced a leverage deficit in 1995, it didn't go about also developing offensive cyber capabilities and counterspace capabilities. The second thing is that I want to show that China often had the capabilities, the kind of technology to pursue these information age weapons for coercive leverage long before the date it actually chose to do so and before it faced these leverage deficits, because I want to demonstrate that these decisions were not simply driven by the availability of technology to pursue these capabilities. Moving on to the posture column, one of the important things that I do in the book is to examine how China actually goes about planning to use these information age weapons, because it's important for the argument that China planned to use them for coercion rather than warfighting. Because if China primarily pursued these capabilities and organized them to be used for warfighting, then this would actually suggest China is coping with the limited war dilemma in a different way than strategic substitution by looking at a conventional military option instead. The final thing that I did was to pair each of these information age weapons with a shadow case that had similar military effects, and you could at least kind of make a plausible case that they could have been pursued for coercive leverage. And what each of the shadow cases are intended to do is to demonstrate what does it actually look like when China pursues a capability or develops a capability primarily for warfighting, both in terms of the decisions, their timing, as well as the posture that China adopts for them. And these shadow cases also demonstrate, I think, some of the contingency, the kind of factors that led to China to choose these three capabilities as its strategic substitution pillars rather than some of these. So things like party-army relations and the availability of technology. So the book draws on what I think is a truly unique set of sources to offer granular insights into decision-making in Beijing. And I acquired a lot of these sources during fieldwork in China before the pandemic. And I wanted to understand both how decisions to pursue these weapons were made by top leaders, how PRC leaders and experts actually compared these capabilities to other types of weapons, as well as how the military actually planned to use these weapons. So to do so, I analyzed hundreds of Chinese language sources, like chronologies of the lives of top military and political decision makers, like this 3-volume set of that chronicle the life and meetings of former Central Military Commission Vice Chairman Liu Baqing. I also looked at military research publications produced by the People's Liberation Army, and then biographies such as this one of the top nuclear scientist and defense industry decision maker Zhu Guangya, who I note actually gave an important speech here at CSAC back at some point in the 1990s. So this place really has an important part in the story of the book. I also conducted about 50 interviews with Chinese experts to both inform my theoretical claims, as well as add context to my empirical analysis. And so I'll now give you a bit of a flavor of what each of the empirical chapters looks like. And here's our friend Zhu Guangya again in the gray jacket, obviously not here at CSAC. Okay, so the first empirical chapter of the book establishes the 2 constraints on China's search for coercive leverage, that it was conventionally inferior to the United States, and its leaders judged that nuclear threats were not going to be credible to an adversary. And in doing so, it examines 3 instances in which China's strategists and top leaders debated China's nuclear policy. 2 of those actually happened concurrently with its leverage deficits in the mid-90s and then later in the early 2000s. Excuse me. And one of the debates took place as the Cold War was ending, and China's strategists were really kind of grappling with how they were going to define the role of nuclear capabilities in their new security environment of the post-Cold War era. Now, that first debate is actually fairly well documented in the existing literature. Harvard professor Alistair Ian Johnson wrote a landmark piece describing the way that the PLA was advocating for what it called a limited nuclear deterrence posture in that early 90s period, which would have added both tactical nuclear weapons and a much larger size to China's nuclear arsenal. But some of the more recent sources that I was able to review for the book actually suggest that this debate was far more nuanced than the sources Johnson was able to review suggested. China's leaders actually considered whether the US-Soviet arms reductions taking place at that point in time suggested that nuclear weapons might actually become obsolete in international politics. So maybe they didn't need to sort of go ahead with modernization programs. Ultimately, though, the case for continuity in China's nuclear policy won out. The quote up on the slide is a recollection of the former nuclear test space commander Qian Xiaojun about the views of defense decision maker Zhu Guangya here in the gray jacket, who oversaw nuclear weapons design work as well as the test space in the 90s. So according to Zhu, the kind of existing principles of China's nuclear policy were still suitable for the environment it faced in the early 90s, and they therefore didn't need to change. So you get a sense for how China debated its nuclear policy and arrived at conclusions about what was appropriate for their new environment. So the first information age weapon that China pursued was in the midst of the Taiwan Strait crisis in December 1995, and that was a missile force that was sort of equipped with conventional payloads that could hold at risk targets in both Taiwan as well as US forces in the region. When the United States issued a visa to Taiwan's President Lee Teng-hui in 1995, China protested with a series of military exercises, including missile tests in the Taiwan Strait. Now, PLA leaders subsequently assessed that those missile tests were effective in deterring further steps towards independence by the Taiwanese, and they decided to then build up a longer range, more accurate and much larger missile force that would be oriented towards coercion. But the reason why China actually had these missiles in the first place to conduct the test is a more complicated story. Organizational interests here play quite an important role, which demonstrates, I think, some of the contingency that influenced which capabilities China decided to pursue as the pillars of strategic substitution. So back in the late 80s, the United States actually pressured China to cancel sales of short-range ballistic missiles that they wanted to export to the Middle East. And the Second Artillery, which was China's then nuclear-only missile force, seized on the opportunity to find a role for itself in a future local war on China's periphery that was unlikely to go nuclear. And this quote from missile-based commander Ge Dongsheng illustrates that these missiles were a way for that particular military organization to avoid the deep humiliation and galling shame that would have ensued if they had to sit on the sidelines while the rest of China's military achieved reunification with Taiwan and they had no part in it. So turning to offensive cyber operations, China pursued offensive cyber capabilities oriented towards coercion after the Belgrade embassy bombing in 1999. And there was a kind of common PLA judgment around that time that nuclear weapons weren't credible or useful, but information deterrence, which included offensive cyber operations against a more advanced and more digitally dependent adversary, was actually going to be a good way of generating a lot of coercive leverage. And not only that, but they were going to be quick and cheap at doing so as well. Initially, China's cyber force posture, the sort of organization for developing these capabilities, was pretty disorganized. It lacked oversight, and it is actually the only one of China's 3 information age weapons for which China adopted delegated command and control arrangements, at least in practice, where lower level commanders had some degree of latitude in how these capabilities were going to be used. And this is despite the fact that we have a picture here of the former top leader, Hu Jintao, looking over a cyber operator's shoulder in a picture that appeared in the PLA Museum some years later. And this delegated command and control sort of set of practices became a problem for China if it wanted to ensure that it only received blowback if it used cyber operations that its leaders had actually authorized the use of those operations in the first place. And this became a bigger issue as China itself became much more digitally dependent, and hence the cost of any of that blowback would increase. And China's leaders then addressed this problem by slowly changing its force posture from one that dialed up escalation risk, so think back to the slippery slope, to one that really tried to manage it like the ladder. And that set of changes really was set in motion after about 2014. So I opened the book with the dramatic test of China's anti-satellite weapon in 2007, which followed a decision a couple of years prior to that point that China would pursue counterspace capabilities for coercive leverage in conventional conflicts. Jiang Zemin's quote here up on the slide, which demonstrates his sort of understanding of the purpose that that anti-satellite capabilities could play in a future conflict, is about the closest that I could find of China acknowledging that decision. Unfortunately, you never find everything you want if you end up studying China's security policy. But it's also worth noting that actually very few countries recognize that they have counterspace capabilities and what they look like. The US only started to talk about some of these capabilities fairly recently. So Chinese sources about counterspace capabilities are often the most explicit in their substitution logic. In the early 2000s through to the mid-2010s, China's sources sort of claim that space deterrence would be much more credible and flexible than nuclear deterrence because it would target military capabilities directly, and that it wouldn't cause, or it also wouldn't directly cause a loss of life. So much more flexible in their estimation. And unlike China's other information age weapons, actually the People's Liberation Army always plan to use their counterspace capabilities in a calibrated manner, so carefully manage the escalation from the use of counterspace capabilities. And it did so before it actually even had the lower level capabilities, those lower rungs on the escalation ladder, and the organizational structures that would be able to implement that posture. But US moves to blunt China's coercive leverage from using its counterspace capabilities have really complicated this pillar of strategic substitution for China. This image up here on the slide actually comes from an article in which some Chinese analysts were assessing a constellation of US satellites that approach other satellites to characterize them, or in China's attitude, it's actually to harass them. And it's one of a couple of recent US space capabilities that really concerns China. So as we move towards the conclusion of the talk, I think it's helpful to step back and think a little bit about whether China's gamble on this novel strategic substitution answer to the limited war dilemma has been a success, a stopgap, or a failure. China's leaders might see this novel answer as having been a success, something that they want to go ahead and continue by building more ground-based counterspace capabilities, as demonstrated in that satellite image. But they also might think that it was just a stopgap until China's conventional military capabilities grew stronger and gave China better options for relying on conventional options for coercion, like our airborne forces in the middle image on the panel there. Finally, though, it might have been a failure, which leads China to actually think more carefully about the nuclear first use option again. In my evaluation, strategic substitution, I think, has succeeded as a stopgap for China, but it has an uncertain future, although I don't yet see China definitively reaching for the nuclear first use option, although it certainly gained better capabilities to adopt that option if it wanted to in the future. And I'll point to, I think, three main constraints on the effectiveness of information age weapons coercion for China: US responses, Chinese entanglement between some of these information age weapons and its nuclear forces, and finally, I think some uncertainty about whether these capabilities can actually deliver on the coercive leverage they promised to when we knew very little about them, often a couple of decades ago. So to go into a bit of detail here, US responses to China's information age weapons have really been designed to blunt the coercive leverage China gains from them. And one example of this is the way that the United States is now launching smaller, lower value satellites to complement the very high value, small number of satellites in orbit that previously made US counterspace attacks such a good source of leverage for China. Similarly, the United States withdrew from the INF Treaty a couple of years ago, meaning that China's very effective use of precision conventional missiles for coercive leverage could actually become the victim of its own success. Turning to the middle point here, there is now growing entanglement among China's information age weapons and its nuclear forces that are going to make it much harder to manage nuclear escalation risks, which is one of the kind of hallmarks as an attractive feature of strategic substitution. This is, I think, clearest in the space cases. We can see our nice little modeling image of a satellite ending up in orbit there, because China has been building out a satellite-based early warning system for its nuclear forces that now complicates China's desire to use counterspace capabilities in higher orbits, because it now pertains to more, or sort of generates more nuclear escalation risks than previously for China itself. Finally, the jury, I think, is still out on whether China's investment in offensive cyber operations has actually delivered on their promise to provide coercive leverage. The United States itself has started to look at cyber operations as something that can't provide like big strategic effects in a conflict, to something that's much more appropriate in the kind of gray zone and below the threshold of armed conflict. PLA cyber experts have been watching what's been happening in Ukraine and started to question the coercive applications and effects of offensive cyber operations based on seeing Russia's failure to actually use these capabilities for decisive advantages at the early stages of that conflict. On the other hand, though, we still see China engaging in a series of cyber intrusions known as Volt Typhoon into US and allied critical infrastructure to pre-position malware, suggesting that China hasn't quite given up on this option for generating coercive leverage just yet. So I'll wrap up just with a couple of points about the contributions of this book to the political science literature. I think first, this book demonstrates how states can use emerging technology to plug gaps in their existing military capabilities. And because every state has slightly different gaps in its military capabilities, they will often use the same technologies in different ways to different effects. Secondly, this book, I think, updates the existing literature on how states engage in coercion if they happen to have nuclear weapons. And previously, that literature had been quite focused on nuclear brinkmanship, but that needs an update because of both technological change generating these new options, as well as the fact that the nuclear club has expanded to include countries that have no first use policies like China and India. So in doing so, it identifies a third way to address the limited war dilemma alongside nuclear brinkmanship, as well as the option of threatening a decisive conventional victory that the United States has so preferred in the post-Cold War era. And finally, I think that this is perhaps one of the most complete empirical as well as theoretically informed accounts of China's strategic weapons decision-making in the existing literature. The sources are a real point of pride for me within this project, and I think they offer us an unprecedented level of detail about China's most hyped but least understood military capabilities. And I'll end just by noting that my hope is that the book is going to contribute to what I see as a demand for more complete international relations theories that can explain China's behavior as part of a broader set of countries' behavior rather than treating it as an outlier. So if you're interested, you can purchase the book from the Princeton University Press website or from Amazon, and I'll look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you. Yeah.
I think I also heard, is it on sale at our bookstore too? Someone mentioned that. I was supposed to mention that. Okay, so that's good to know. They'll also be sitting outside with copies of the book if you want one. Is that a question?
Yes.
Okay, because I was looking for fellows first.
That's not necessary for the director. So.
Oh, there you go.
Go ahead and let the fellow speak.
Go ahead.
Okay, I guess I have a microphone, right? Thank you so much for the great talk, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. I have two questions, and I really know nothing about China and Chinese nuclear policies, so I'm looking forward to your answers. So one is this theory of strategic substitution genuine to China, or have you seen that or elements of it play out in other contexts too? And the second, I was wondering if there's any changes with current developments around AI that you can see, because you said you focused on space and offensive cyber and missiles, right? Sorry. But is there anything that you can observe regarding AI capabilities?
So thanks very much for the questions, and I'm glad you're interested in reading the book. Means I've done my job with the talk. So I'll say a couple of words about both kind of the generalizability of the arguments in terms of other countries, but also other technologies, which your AI question sort of pertains to. I made a decision probably while I was actually here at CSAC when I was grappling with like what the scope of this book should be, that it is primarily an argument about China, but it is an argument that can travel in a couple of layers. So the first layer of this is that there are a set of conditions that other countries might also find themselves in that look very similar to the conditions China found itself in that could lead them also to adopt strategic substitution wholesale. And those are things like they face a limited conflict with an adversary to whom they're conventionally inferior. They have doubts about the credibility of using nuclear weapons, and therefore they're looking for coercive leverage, but the nuclear option and the conventional options are not quite on the table for them. The closest analog here is probably India in its border conflict with China. Again, India's nuclear forces were not really designed to deter China primarily, but rather to deter Pakistan. So you see the nuclear weapons also in the kind of strategy oriented towards a different kind of conflict. And we do see a little bit of evidence of India developing some of these information age weapons following the Galwan Valley incident in 2020. So investing more in its offensive cyber capabilities, and even prior to that conflict, testing counterspace capabilities and citing the China threat. But I do think one of the differences with India is that you do see a little bit more interest or a little bit more confidence, perhaps, in the possibility of nuclear first-use threats being credible. See that in the work of Vipin Narang and Christopher Clary and some work that they've done previously. The second layer, though, is that the reasons why China and any other country might develop strategic substitution are actually pretty pervasive. So things like being concerned about conventional inferiority vis-a-vis a nuclear armed adversary, being concerned about the credibility of making nuclear threats. Like, these are not things that, just China feels, but pretty much every nuclear weapon state that is inferior to its adversaries in the conventional space has these, is going to be worried about the conventional inferiority, and similarly can be a little bit worried about the credibility of nuclear threats. So adding these information age weapons options, it may not be kind of substituting for their theory of victory wholesale, but it can certainly sort of provide complements to a country's existing kind of primary answer to the limited war dilemma by giving it better options between nuclear first use and conventional conflict. The third way I think in which this theory might travel is to countries that actually can't access the nuclear weapons option at all. So here you might think about US allies who have a nuclear umbrella that's provided by the United States, and they want independent sources of leverage, but they're going to destroy their alliance if they go about seeking their own independent nuclear deterrent. Similarly, you might think of Iran as being a country that is going to face really hefty punishments if it decides to pursue a nuclear weapon, but might find ways of gaining this leverage by pursuing these information age weapons. The difference there, though, is if you don't have your own nuclear weapon sitting at the top of the escalation ladder, you're always going to be vulnerable to your adversaries' efforts to threaten and coerce you with nuclear weapons in response to your provocative information age weapons attacks. Turning now to just quickly to the AI question, I'll start here just by making a distinction that I think is fairly common in the existing literature, that artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology rather than a sort of specific weapons technology. So it's a different sort of type of technology in that way. And so using AI as for coercive leverage sort of doesn't quite make as much sense as using offensive cyber operations or counterspace capabilities that are actually a kind of weapons technology. But we might think of ways in which AI can interact with any one of these information age weapons or other types of capabilities in order to make them more effective. But similarly, AI can also interface with a country's nuclear posture or its conventional military capabilities too, to enhance them. So it's going to have an impact across all of the potential answers to the limited war dilemma, rather than serving as another option or another pillar alongside them.
All right. Yeah.
Great. Perfect talk, Fiona. And so it's great to see how far the project has come since you were at CSEC. I thought you did a beautiful job of illustrating how the US has uniquely large attack surfaces in these three areas so that China can disproportionately generate leverage relatively quickly. But I'm still wondering what the role of time is in this. And specifically, if I understood you correctly, you said you didn't really theorize why they picked brinksmanship over the graduated ladder. But I wonder if it makes sense when you're just first fielding a capability to rely on brinksmanship for threats that leave something to chance, because you don't even know how good your capabilities are. But you certainly would want to convince the United States that their chance is very good. And once you actually have more confidence in your capabilities, then you might switch over to the graduated ladder.
Thank you very much for the question, Harold, and thank you for noting how much projects change in their evolution from this began as my PhD dissertation quite some time ago. So gladly it has evolved. I think I point to a couple of factors that I think influence choices to move from one force posture to another, or why a country might sort of select them. I don't sort of provide a theory where I could say, this is which one you're going to predict, and this is the one that you wouldn't. And a couple of the factors that I think influence force posture choices are as follows. One is definitely this sort of question of time, and I would sort of unpack what you suggested into sort of two slightly different factors. One of them is that, when you start developing these capabilities, you don't necessarily have all the technologies that are going to be necessary to, have organizational structures, have very low level, for example, counterspace capabilities that give you these options on the lower level of the ladder. In the case of a missile force, a country needs to build both a sensing layer as well as accuracy if they want to be able to target things very specifically, rather than firing off missiles that might be far wide of their targets and end up, hitting something else, and therefore could be quite unpredictably escalatory. So there's a kind of technological evolution piece to it. I think the other thing is, though, that some of these capabilities themselves actually evolve over time. And the clearest one, I think, is in cyberspace. I think that the nature of offensive cyber operations, the attack surface, what we actually now sort of know and understand about the dynamics of cyber operations, it's pretty different to what, China and the United States were sort of writing and thinking about 20 or even 10 years ago, or even when we were perhaps sitting in this room 5 or 6 years ago when I was a postdoc here at CSAC. So the technology evolves as well in ways that I think can influence the posture choices. But I think that there are two other things that really matter in the China case. One of them is party-army relations, that all things being equal, a country like China wants to keep its most strategic military capabilities on a pretty tight leash. So its leaders do not have to worry about their people kind of doing things that they didn't authorize. And so when you have a calibrated escalation force posture, that actually involves a whole set of structures to really try and keep those the use of those capabilities under control, and the people using them under control with sort of oversight mechanisms. And then the other thing that I think influences the posture choices in China's case, I alluded to a little bit in the cyber case, which is that when you have no capabilities or you have nothing really of value that an adversary could attack in kind, you might be more cavalier about using an information age weapon. But if you happen to have a very extensive satellite constellation, or you are deeply digitally dependent yourself, perhaps you're going to be a little bit more careful about using weapons that have unpredictable effects, cyber operations that could sort of end up spreading far beyond their original targets. And so I think that also kind of influences the piece. But I think without more cases, it's a little bit difficult. And looking at other countries, I would be a bit hesitant to offer a kind of falsifiable theory of what drives those choices.
That was great. Thank you. You described 3 sort of technical responses: the counterspace, precision munitions, and offensive cyber. And one question that I have is, do you see that China has tried to integrate all of these things, work together as a way of offsetting U.S. leverage? Or do they sort of see, is their doctrinal position one of they sort of all work independently? Or and I also note that while you're correct that the U.S. is trying to do things to counter their anti-satellite capabilities and their precision-guided conventional weapons, there ain't, in fact, a whole lot we can do about their offensive cyber. So I was wondering if you could comment on all that. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the comments, Herb. I think where I come down on the kind of integration piece is that China has strategically integrated these capabilities, but not operationally integrated. In other words, I think that there is a clear sort of sense in both you see it in Chinese military writings and in sort of how you see all of these capabilities postured of where they're meant to sit in relation to nuclear weapons and their kind of role within China's military strategy, and the distinctive ways in which these capabilities can generate leverage in ways that China's kind of general purpose warfighting capabilities cannot. So there is integration in the sense that China sees a sort of distinct relationship between, or a complementary relationship, if you like, between the role that nuclear weapons, conventional capabilities, and these information age weapons are playing. Operationally, though, I have not seen a lot of evidence that China has sort of thought about how, how do you get a military commander to sort of orchestrate all of these effects so that they're not working at cross purposes? How do you think about the fact that if you start using counterspace capabilities and an adversary responds, you might end up knocking out all of the satellites that actually need to guide your precision guided munitions to their targets, or to give you battle damage assessment to know whether or not those attacks have been effective. So there are sort of ways in which these information age weapons postures can end up impacting each other in ways that diminish your ability to keep on using information age weapons for coercive leverage in the way that China might have intended. In addition, we have very little sense of like how China would actually go about planning to use these capabilities in a conflict, at least in the open source literature. The one thing that we can point to is some descriptions in biographies of China's military leaders during the Taiwan Strait crisis, in which basically they describe the way that the PLA chief of staff, who then becomes the Central Military Commission vice chairman, is kind of sitting there in the operations room, like getting orders and reporting back up to the top leader, Jiang Zemin, and then directly feeding those orders out to the 2nd Artillery, the Rocket Force headquarters. I don't think that one individual is going to be able to do that in the midst of a shooting war when they're trying to coordinate the effects of all three of these capabilities, as well as everything else that's on their plate. So how China actually puts these capabilities together and thinks of them as packages from a menu of options so that they don't impact each other is something I haven't seen the evidence for. It doesn't mean it's not there, but I would not count on China being able to sort of necessarily orchestrate things as delicately as we might expect.
Right.
Hi, Fiona. Thanks so much. This was a really thought-provoking talk. I have two questions. I'm just trying to remember them. So the first one is these sort of moments in which you describe that there's this awareness of a legitimacy deficit. I think that's what the term that you used.
Leverage deficit.
Leverage deficit. Sorry. You know, and you had that flow chart where they chose strategic substitution, but they had those two alternative things that they didn't do either because they couldn't or because they didn't want to. And I'm just wondering whether during those moments, these crises, there's any actual sort of reflection or contemplation on there are these three options, and we don't have access to, we can't do the first two, and so therefore we need to do this third thing. So I'm just wondering whether, like, what does that substitution logic look like when it's actually playing out? And relatedly, during the way I sort of understood the talk, there are these, you know, exogenous sort of moments or events that lead to that create incentives for pursuing information age weapons. And I'm wondering whether that's also taking place in this broader context of learning, where the first time that this happens and there's this realization that we have this vulnerability and we need to plug this vulnerability, that sort of sets off this sort of self-perpetuating maybe discourse, or people begin sort of thinking about this and writing about this, and then these future sort of crises become sort of catalysts in some ways to sort of galvanize the debate even further. I don't know if that makes sense.
Just on the last question, can you just repeat a little bit more what on the learning piece that?
So how much of this is that, like, there's a crisis and then there's sort of like this realization that we have this vulnerability gap that needs to be plugged, and or is it that, like, all of this is taking place in this larger context of sort of learning, like of that, you know, we don't have recourse to these first two pathways, and so we need to start thinking about over a broader period of time. There's this sort of like, I guess, this discourse about, you know, what can we do to shore up these gaps.
Great, thank you very much for the questions. So I think in the book I spent quite a bit of time sort of trying to work through or describe what these decision-making processes sort of look like within China, because this is really about like the aftermath of crises. And so you see in some of the Chinese sources clear descriptions where it sort of starts with, I'll take the Belgrade embassy bombing as an example here. immediately after the bombing happens, Jiang Zemin calls this emergency Politburo meeting, and he's really upset and says, we can't be bullied. The Chinese people, can't be sort of pushed around like this. This is a big deal. It's not a trivial event, and we basically need to do something about it. And that sort of triggers whenever the top leader in China says we need to do something, then everyone goes, okay, what's that? And sort of springs into action. And so then you see a set of kind of meetings, research projects, investigations that happen within the People's Liberation Army about, how do they need to sort of think what it is that they're doing to deal with the fact that they've learned something about the kind of country the US is. They've learned something about the proximity of conflict, especially in the context of Belgrade, which was a humanitarian intervention and raised specter for China of, whether its borderlines could end up being the site of these kinds of interventions going forward. And so following on from that, they then start to develop options, right? So you're tasking smaller groups of different experts within the military for sort of thinking about, well, what can we do? What should we do in the long term? What should we do in the short term? And you see the sort of CMC vice chairman, saying like we need to just not just think about what we can learn from this conflict about how China needs to fight in the long term, but we also need to think about sort of stopgaps in the short term. And that research effort sort of leads in particular into research about the role of offensive cyber capabilities within that conflict. So you can sort of trace through the way that the crises sort of serve as a trigger, and they reveal something, China learns something about the future in which it's going to have to look, and then it goes and looks for alternative options. And you see sort of at the same time, often there's a debate about nuclear strategy that emerges contemporaneously with this search for leverage. So that happens in the early 2000s. But also in the course of this understanding that the PLA's conventional military modernization campaign isn't going to bear fruit for many decades into the future. And so one thing China could have done is just to basically say, okay, well, we're just going to bide our time and put all of our resources into conventional modernization and hope that nothing happens. But if there had been another crisis, then China would have been potentially in a more difficult position if they hadn't built up something to sort of give them that stopgap in the interim. So that's sort of, it's a little bit of both from what you say, right? Which is that there's a trigger from these kind of crises, but then there is also like a learning process that's triggered by that crisis where China goes and evaluates and reevaluates past options to think about what's the best pathway forward to serve the national interests and what they now understand about their strategic environment.
All right, I got Rose.
Thank you very much, Fiona. This was a fantastic report out on your research, and congratulations on your original sources. I think that's a huge accomplishment. I was really struck when you said that there's one. And I found that fascinating because I haven't known of any examples of that kind of delegation occurring, but you also note that they pretty quickly pulled back from that and had second thoughts. I'm just wondering, fast forwarding to the current period when the Chinese at the highest level, Xi Jinping has been willing to sign up with Joe Biden to this statement about not using artificial intelligence in nuclear command and control. So they seem quite about similar public high-level statements about including AI from national command and control decision making where nuclear weapons are concerned. So I know the Chinese up to this point and the Russians say, no, we're not going to try to convince the other. Don't try to recruit us. But I just wonder if you think there might be some opportunity there for at least quiet influence. Thank you.
Okay. Rose, thank you very much for the questions and the comments as well. And I will just say that I hope that that it will continue to be possible to do this kind of research about Chinese foreign policy at the moment. And I know that I share that with some of the others that are here in this room, that this continues to be something that the field of political science and international relations does, because these are difficult conditions in which to continue to study Chinese security affairs using these kinds of sources. So to just go back to the point about delegating command and control with the Chinese cyber operations, I just emphasize here that I think you see in some of the Chinese sources, emphasis that strategic level cyber operations would be, or strategic level, I should say, information operations, including cyber operations, would be controlled by the National Command Authority, the kind of highest supreme command. But then we see evidence, and I think the behavior of Chinese cyber operators, especially with regards to industrial espionage back around the 2012 to 2014 period, where it certainly didn't look like the top leadership had a particularly good handle on what China's cyber operators were doing, whether by sort of benign neglect or genuine sort of oversight as to what exactly was going on. So I'd emphasize that this, I think, is a more de facto rather than a de jure delegation of command and control. What is interesting about it, though, is that even since China's leaders, and the one thing that you see very clearly in Chinese sources discussing the future of cyber operations after 2012, is that you need a much more centralized command system in order to operate these capabilities, to sort of ensure that you're not duplicating or basically using them inefficiently. And you see the leadership saying very carefully that we're concerned about illegal online activity and we need to properly manage the nature of kind of cyber operations. China, though, nevertheless, after 2015, after sort of making these changes, has still sort of struggled in some ways to keep full control over the cyber operations forces, because it is also pulled in the direction of trying to bring talent in from other parts of the government and from the private sector to be able to bolster the capabilities of its cyber operations. So there's kind of a constant push and pull there. But I think the clearest example that we have that something has changed within China is there was I think a Wall Street Journal report earlier this year in which they reported that some of the Biden administration officials met with Chinese cyber officials. I believe that it might have been in Geneva or Vienna or something like that. And they said, basically, we're really concerned, China, about these Volt Typhoon intrusions into our critical infrastructure, because the Biden team was actually quite concerned that a similar thing was happening to back when you had a lot of industrial espionage conducted by PLA operators. And they wanted to make sure that China's top leaders knew what their operators were doing. And to their surprise, apparently one of the Chinese officials said back to them, yes, this has got to do with your Taiwan policy. So a clear sort of signal that while they weren't saying this is definitely us, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, but that is a pretty explicit sort of suggestion that no, this stuff is not happening by accident. Turning to the kind of Lima statement about a human in control of decisions to use nuclear weapons, I actually was talking to doing some interviews about these issues in China fairly recently. And I think what's curious is that for China in a capability sense, I don't think that this was a difficult statement to make, but I think politically it was quite difficult for the two leaders to actually get that statement over the line in the end. And I think there are sort of concerns that a country like China might trust its algorithms rather than people when it comes to the use of weapons in a future conflict. And so there is, I think, a little bit of just like a tendency concern on the US side about China's adherence to these kinds of statements. But within China, I think there is a sense that this was not a difficult thing for them to sort of sign on to. What I think is interesting with regards to the China-Russia relationship is that recently China released a new white paper on national security, in which they described efforts within the Ukraine conflict to avoid a nuclear crisis from occurring. And there have been sort of, I think, oblique references diplomatically, but also signs sort of trickling out of China that the use of nuclear weapons within the Ukraine conflict would be a kind of bottom line for them, or a red line that would have some unknown impact on the nature of Russia-China relations. So while that sort of perhaps doesn't speak directly to persuading Russia to sign on to a statement that might move them away from the sort of dead hand system that they appear quite wedded to, it does suggest that there is a schism in how Russia and China think about nuclear weapons, that at the very least China is keen to delineate differences between the two countries, even if it's not in a position necessarily to influence or to choose to or use its influence to change Russian behavior. So that's probably not a wholly satisfying answer, but certainly there's an awareness on the Chinese side that their approach to nuclear issues is different from that of the Russians.
Thank you. All right, well, lucky for me, I'm next on the list. So I have sort of just like, what do you think about this type of thing? Where does economic coercion fall into this as a sort of substitutable thing? You mentioned that the substitutability is because they felt like nuclear threats were not credible. But countries like Pakistan, Russia that have conventional inferiorities in some way seem to think nuclear threats are credible. I find Chinese nuclear threats to be very credible. So what was it? Is it just like a threshold thing based on the scenarios in which they wanted to coerce that nuclear threats wouldn't be credible in those? I think we find like Taiwan issues, they probably would be pretty credible. And then just last on the policy, when you talk about the future, is it a stopgap? Is it a failure? I wonder, I often say that cyber doesn't hold territory, so that there's certain contingencies in which things like cyber and space, while they enable conventional, like you couldn't actually coerce enough to get to where you want. So I'm just curious, and like if you've thought about, instead of it sort of being one of those three, is it kind of like contingency based? Like in a Taiwan scenario, it was a stopgap measure, but in the South China Sea scenario, it continues. Can you have all three of those future responses at the same time?
That's a really interesting question, actually, thinking on the contingency specificity of it. My instinct would probably be to say that there is a certain stickiness to these capabilities, and I do see a lot of the way that China, certainly its strategic deterrence capabilities, are sort of architected is very much directed towards high-end warfare that is going to involve the United States, rather than thinking about the South China Sea or lower level contingencies. But of course, China is using certainly the offensive cyber capabilities and potentially also the missile capabilities to intimidate US adversaries in these kind of lower level territorial contingencies, and those allies don't have their own nuclear weapons, and they're not sort of in some ways what strategic substitution was architected to counter. But China has gained the capability to intimidate those countries as well in that sense. So I guess it probably looks a little bit different, but depends very much on, whether the US is intervening in some of these contingencies. On the other 2 points, so I recognize that economic coercion is obviously an important tool of coercive leverage in international politics. The focus of the book, though, really is on thinking about sort of the use of force as being the ultima ratio, if you like, in the way that countries are engaging in coercion. It's not to say that you can't have economic coercion also being involved in any given conflict at the same time, but this is sort of really about the sort of military tools, if you like. So economic coercion could potentially be a complementary thing that a country does, but it is not, I would argue, a theory of victory that helps you cope with a limited war dilemma. So, quite different from using nuclear threats, using conventional military capabilities, or using these substitutes to sort of threaten escalation in that manner. So you could see that happen at the same time. I guess a little bit, you could also put a kind of influence operations and information operations in a bucket of something that you'd also perhaps see occurring in the midst of a conflict that could try and shape it, but that sort of doesn't become a theory of victory, if you like, for how you engage in or how you fight and win limited wars with a nuclear armed adversary. On the nuclear credibility piece, so the kind of language that Chinese leaders and strategists are often using sits in the kind of category of if an adversary can retaliate with the use of nuclear weapons, then threatening the use of nuclear weapons first just isn't necessarily going to be credible. Like, no one wants a nuclear war. You can't control it if it's going to happen. And so threatening this is just not really going to be taken seriously. Now, obviously, China was making a lot of these kinds of arguments in the 90s and 2000s when it had an incredibly weak nuclear deterrent compared to the United States. And so threatening nuclear first use might have been particularly non-credible for the PRC because the United States had a quite significant nuclear superiority over China. But a lot of the interviews that I've conducted sort of have suggested, at least up until recently, that China was not quite as concerned about the extent of US superiority, provided that they had the capacity to retaliate for nuclear attacks. So there is, I think, a little bit of a tension in how China sometimes understands the credibility of nuclear threats and the threats posed by US nuclear weapons in particular, because on the one hand, they'll sort of say, well, nuclear first use threats are not necessarily going to be credible. They're not worth it for the kinds of things that are going to be at stake in a future conflict. But at the same time, then they'll look at the fact that the United States is developing certain capabilities and worry quite a bit about counterforce strikes or limited nuclear strikes from the United States. And they can sort of hold these two things in their head at the same time, that we're concerned about what the United States might do, but provided that we then go and do things with our own nuclear capabilities that make them sufficiently robust, that's going to deter the US from actually using them in a conflict. I think that's kind of how they square the circle, but the views of the credibility of nuclear threats are, I think, quite distinct within China. And I think it's one that I would watch very carefully to see whether or not they're changing within the PRC right now.
All right, I've got Jim next.
Great. Jim Goldgarn, research affiliate here. You may have answered my question already, so you could just answer me by saying I've already answered your question. I'm trying to sort out some of the answers that you gave. I'm in that chart that you showed again that Todd just mentioned. The leverage deficit, and then you had the two paths: pursue leverage, don't pursue leverage, and everything was about what you do when you're pursuing leverage. And I was interested in that don't pursue leverage option, and just curious about like what would go into decision making to go down that route. And does that matter?
Yeah, I think it absolutely matters. So no, I actually haven't answered your question. So I will start by clarifying that. I think that what happens on the sort of bottom arm is, like, imagine that you don't have a Taiwan Strait crisis. Imagine that you don't have a Belgrade embassy bombing. What's China going to do when it comes to thinking about its options for coercive leverage in that part? There's no urgency in that instance, right? So China could potentially say, all right, I'm just going to modernize my conventional capabilities, and I don't really need anything to sort of fill in the gap in the interim because I can sort of define the timelines. So countries obviously want leverage for a variety, coercive leverage, even for a variety of reasons. They might have an expansion in their foreign policy interests. So suddenly you have to kind of do things that your military didn't previously need to do. You might have these sort of growing ambitions or other reasons why you want leverage, but you can kind of set your own timelines in that case, right? And so you have a little bit more flexibility about how you think about your military forces, because you don't necessarily need to immediately come up with an answer to the limited war dilemma. And you haven't actually experienced something, to go back to one of the earlier questions, that reveals to you that there's any problem in the first place, right? So if there was no Taiwan Strait crisis, China just sort of went, and no Belgrade embassy bombing, China goes the whole way through until right now. Maybe they end up pursuing these information age weapons more for war fighting, sort of folding them into their conventional military capabilities. And their goal in the long term is, we want to rely on our conventional capabilities that can, achieve a decisive victory in the Taiwan Strait. And we're not necessarily going to need these things. So there is a kind of more relaxed security environment that occurs on that bottom arm that means that you can afford to sort of take your time in the capabilities that you develop, and you also might not know as much about what kinds of adversaries you're facing. So there's also probably a little bit more uncertainty about exactly what it is that you need and how you're doing in terms of that bank of leverage at any given point in time.
Right, go ahead. Hi, thank you, Fiona. Ori Rabinowitz, I'm a visiting scholar here. Thank you for a wonderful talk. You mentioned that the Chinese were basically following and examining what other actors were doing in different spheres. So I wanted to ask you, like you mentioned, you mentioned they were following Russian deployment of cyber weapons in Ukraine. Were they similarly following, in your knowledge, the deployment of Stuxnet before, and what did they make of it? Did they impact any kind of perceptions they had on cyber weapons? And were they similar, or were they similarly following what the US was doing in the war in the Middle East, the deployment of the carriers, the ability to intercept missiles and drones, and what strategic thinking and similar processes were unfolding?
Great. And when you say the war in the Middle East, you mean the one that's
Anything, pick one.
Okay, all right. I was going to say, if it's the one that is
Pick the good one.
pick the good one. Okay. So in short, I mean, China is constantly watching all of these things. One of the sources that I'm citing in this book is called Foreign Military Arts, and that is all they do, is sit there and analyze foreign military capabilities, foreign military operations. China writes reports on other people's wars. So they're constantly sort of watching what is going on. And so they certainly have been watching what's going on with Russian cyber operations. And there's quite a lot of analysis of just like, what does this mean for the future of cyber operations? Was Russia basically like trying to keep its powder dry for something else it needed to do with NATO? Are they just, much better oriented towards intelligence and disruption rather than coordinating cyber operations with, conventional attacks? So sort of analyzing like, what's the core, like, or was it the fact that Ukrainian cyber operators were super hardened on defenses after having been attacked for a decade, or the assistance from the United States, or et cetera, et cetera. So they sort of look at a number of different factors for why it is that you didn't perhaps see them being a game changer as China might have expected based on some of their earlier cyber writings. They certainly followed a lot of the earlier cyber attacks. So in the Russia-Georgia war, Stuxnet received plenty of coverage and analysis within the PRC as a kind of proof of concept that you could use cyber operations for disruption and sabotage. But obviously, it's a different kind of operation from doing things in a conflict that you really don't mind if somebody else, and actually you probably want them to know it's you who's engaging in it, right? So they were seeing things that had been sort of envisaged and imagined about the nature of cyber operations, the kind of rubber hitting the road in that sort of 2000s period. I don't think, though, that those demonstrations of the potential of cyber operations would have had the impact that they did in kind of realizing what a threat it would pose if a country attacked China with cyber operations, if it hadn't also been digitizing dramatically during that time. So you see China's own set of cyber penetration rate go from below 5% when the Belgrade embassy bombing happens up until over 30% by 2010. And so that's when they start to say, okay, not only are we watching what we thought could happen with these operations actually sort of occur and showing that you can cause physical damage with cyber operations, but also like now we're getting pretty digitally dependent ourselves. So we need to actually think about threats to ourselves rather than only thinking about what we might be able to do to other countries. They also did sort of look at it and go, wow, we're really behind the United States in conducting these operations. With regards to what the United States has been doing in recent conflicts, I think if I think about the missile interception in the current years, that's just a little bit too recent for what I've been able to cover. I haven't had a chance to sort of ask or talk to people about how they assess the implications of what the US has managed to do in terms of missile defense there. But they are, sort of constantly watching what's going on with the missile defense pieces. That said, if I think back to what I've seen in terms of recent, table of contents of journals looking at foreign military operations, don't recall seeing a ton about what's happening in the current Middle Eastern war. There's a ton on Ukraine, but less on the Middle East.
This might be the last one. We'll see.
Okay, I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. Fiona, lovely to see you back here at CSEC, and congratulations on the book. That's amazing. So two kind of separate questions, pick one or neither as you see fit. In the 2018, I guess the first Trump administration, the United States modified its nuclear posture review to indicate that we were reserving the right to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear strategic attacks, right? So cyber. And I'm wondering, like, when the Chinese sort of thought about we're going to do this thing, like, under the nuclear shadow, did they ever like contemplate that, like, whoops, it's going to be brought into the nuclear spotlight? What was was there any reaction at all on the part of the Chinese to the inclusion of strategic non-nuclear attacks, cyber attacks as something that the U.S. might use nuclear weapons in response to? Second unrelated question. I mean, I just saw in the paper like a couple of days ago, I was very surprised to see reportedly the Chinese said that like the deployment of a Golden Dome, missile defense shield would violate the Outer Space Treaty. And I know that you've done work on, China's thinking about nuclear weapons and international law. And I'm just wondering, did you see anything about their ASAP program and international law in the research that you did?
It's a really good question. I'm just thinking about the sort of ASAT piece. Less about China's own ASAT program being a violation of any stipulation in international law. That sort of doesn't necessarily come up, although there are obviously a number of ways in which you might see provisions of the Outer Space Treaty for things like, creating hazardous debris, I believe is one of the articles in there that would be violated by using an anti-satellite weapon. But, if you don't use it, then no problemo, I guess. So if you think of this as a tool of deterrence, that's one thing. But if you actually end up going about using these capabilities, then there's a very interesting question about how China would justify some of these choices in terms of international law. Stepping back more broadly, though, I think there has been quite an interesting trend. I don't cover this in the book necessarily, but China has been quite a bit more active in nuclear diplomacy recently and thinking about how treaties could or how rather US nuclear behavior could end up tripping over some of the treaty restraints. And so I believe there was some PRC diplomatic positions suggesting that, for example, US nuclear sharing was in violation of the NPT. And so there's a greater willingness to sort of use these legal mechanisms, if you like, to generate costs and pushback against what the United States conceives of as longstanding kind of diplomatic or rather longstanding nuclear practices. So there is certainly like that sort of trend within China. On the 2018 NPR piece, this is particularly interesting with the inclusion of non-nuclear strategic attacks, because prior to that point, I'd had a number of conversations with Chinese strategists, probably should be cited in the book, in which at least some of them just said basically it wouldn't be credible to use a nuclear weapon in response to something like a cyber attack. So they were dismissing these arguments as sort of not being credible. But at the same time, I think the writings in response to that 2018 nuclear posture review complained about the fact that US declaratory policy was lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. So, how they sort of square that circle of lowering the threshold versus not being credible again gets back to some of the things that I've highlighted in responses to other questions about how China has a sort of tension between sort of saying things are not credible but then appearing to be concerned about them as well at the same time. I'm just sort of trying to think, in addition to that, I think initially before I had gone and done a whole set of interviews about China's nuclear modernization, additional work, I would have perhaps speculated that one of the reasons why China could have modernized its nuclear forces could have been to build a stronger nuclear shield, not for engaging in conventional military operations, but rather so that when they engage in these provocative uses of information age weapons, that the United States hesitates about threatening nuclear weapons first use in response. So you could think of that modernization as perhaps its intent is not to do so, but it certainly fortifies China's ability to engage in strategic substitution by making it more costly for the United States to think about threatening nuclear first use in response. But I will just pause to say that I think in parts of the book, I do look at how China signals its plans to use these information age weapons, and often does so through participation in diplomatic fora, sometimes through treaty negotiations, sometimes through things like the group of governmental experts and open-ended working group mechanisms at the United Nations. But there is a huge amount more work that is necessary, appropriate, and very interesting about how each of these capabilities intersects with China's efforts to shape the rules that govern them.
You can join me in thanking Fiona for